Yeah, hello. My name is Jan Rolf. I'm one of the organizers of CTM Festival. A very warm hello and welcome to all of you and to all the participants of today's first day of 2 afternoons under the title, The Time for Denial is Over. I want to thank the members of Group 5050 and all participants who will contribute to the next 2 days for trusting us to be a platform for sharing these crucial conversations. And especially because, let's say, as a music festival, the questions around the complex histories and often violent histories of immaterial heritage, of archives, the question of understanding processes of cultural appropriation, of what does it afford to have an equal dialogue, and how do we arrive and shape at fair and ethical practices, at collaborations across geographies, across cultures, need to critically inform also our practice as a festival. So we are thankful for that opportunity. We take it as an opportunity to also listen and reflect. And here, before I hand over the microphone to Patrick Mudekereza, who is a writer, an author, and co-founder of Group 5050, and also the director of Centre d'Art Vaza in Lubumbashi, and to Eva-Maria Bertschy, a freelance dramaturg, also co-founder of Group 5050, and director, also a co-director of Studio Rizoma in Palermo. So before I hand over the microphone, I like to thank the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, that's the federal agency for civic education here in Germany, for enabling this discourse program, and also to the federal foundation, sorry, to the Federal Cultural Foundation of Germany, namely their program Turn 2, and the Federal Government Commissioner for Culture and the Media, who supported the process and the staging of the new music theater piece, The Ghosts Are Returning, which we are all hopefully about to see at 7 p.m. over at the How 1. Yeah, I think that's it from my end, no? So thank you, and welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Jan, and thank you to all of you for being here. Yeah, so it's a great pleasure for us, my colleague Eva and myself, to be in this amazing festival, and also to finish this tour with Berlin, which for Group 5050 and is a very important component. So we have been in many cities in Germany, in Switzerland and Austria. And next Sunday we go to Congo, where we'll perform next weekend in Lubumbashi and the following weekend in Kinshasa. So for us, being in Berlin is really touching, because we know the criticality of the audience here, and we know the possibility of building new ways of thinking in the culture. So we have a lot of expectation of this kind of connection we can have here. But also for historical reason, Berlin Conference, of course, and so many things. Berlin has always been a key point for discussion about what is happening in the world and in Africa. So it's for us very important. And also to mix the performance, The Ghosts Are Returning, that will be performed at 7 p.m. today at How 1, with this Time for Denial is Over. Very provocative but true title to discuss about restitution. So we have designed the program of the all trains from Palermo in June to Kinshasa in 2 weeks with my colleague Eva-Maria Bertschy. And Berlin has been, as a half Berliner, she has been very keen to design this part. So I will handle it to her to explain what is happening. And I'm also pleased also be there tomorrow. We continue the discussion with some amazing guests as well. Eva?
Thank you. I would like to introduce a bit this session. First, I would like to ask Mwazulu Diyabanza and Sarah Imani on stage. They will speak in a minute. Mwazulu, s'il te plaît, venez ici. So the Time for Denial is Over is a series that we began somehow in the working process on when we began to work on the piece The Ghosts Are Returning that you will see tonight. And it is born somehow with the desire of us, of our group, of the group 50/50, to exchange a little bit on different issues and very complicated questions that we were confronted with in this process, in this artistic process. And we had the desire to invite other people who are working for many, many years, decades sometimes, on these same questions that are very much involved in this process of restitution, and to discuss with them on several topics. For tonight, or for this first session here, we will talk about the question of ownership. Who is the owner, actually, of all these objects that are in the museums here in Europe? And should we talk about ownership, or are maybe other rights more important than ownership? And I would like just to introduce quickly with a small anecdote somehow why this question became important for us. So we were working on this story about 7 skeletons. You will see the piece tonight, so you will learn much more about it tonight. But these 7 skeletons are in the archive in Geneva, at the university. And the University of Geneva had the idea at some point, when they understood that these skeletons should not stay there, to make a contract or to design a contract between the owner of these 7 skeletons, who is the daughter of Boris Ade, the doctor that brought the skeletons from Congo to Geneva in the 50s, and the University of Lubumbashi, who is now the owner of these skeletons. At the beginning, I thought, okay, this might be something legitimate, but at some point, of course, you understand that it's completely absurd somehow to talk about ownership when you talk about the remains of people, of human beings, when you talk about ancestral remains of the Mbuti people in Congo. So I was wondering who is working on this issue somehow, and so I invited, well, Mwazulu Diyabanza, we invited him again to talk here because he was, of course, at the beginning somehow already inspiring our project and all our work. Mwazulu Diyabanza is an activist. He's living in Paris, but originally from Congo. And he, at some point, decided to do what many people would like to do, maybe. He went to the museum and took out some objects to bring them back where they belong to. He also is the founder of the how is it called? The Transcultural Front of, huh?
It's the Multicultural Front Against Looting.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't look at my notes. So And he's here to talk tonight about this question of ownership. And we also asked Sarah Imani from the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights to talk about this question from a more juridical point of view. And I'm very happy that they're here and would like to ask Mwazulu to make his first speech. So they will both make a short speech of 15 and 20 minutes. Mwazulu will talk in French and he will be translated in consecutive by our translators over there. And yes, and after that we would like to open directly to the public, because in this series it was always very important for us to talk with the people we invited. So it's not a discussion between us, but a discussion with you. So yes, this is a bit what we'd like to do now. Thank you. Mwazulu, s'il te plaît. Oui.
Mesdames et messieurs, militantes et militants, combattantes et combattants, activistes, acteurs culturels et membres de la communauté humaine, recevez mes salutations fraternelles et militantes les plus engagées.
Madam and Mr. Militants, fighters, activists, cultural actors, members of the human community, receive my patriotic militant salutation, the most engaged.
Depuis cette ville de Berlin que j'ai connue par les truchements de mon ancêtre, Diyabanza Mwazulu, lui qui est mort, parti aux cieux, est revenu aujourd'hui parmi nous à travers ma personne.
From this city of Berlin that I've known through my father, my ancestor, Diyabanza Mwazulu, him that is dead, gone to heaven, and returned through us, to us through me.
C'est dans cette ville de Berlin que s'est tenu l'un des plus grands bals des colonialistes en 1884, à savoir la conférence de Berlin.
It's in this city of Berlin that has been held one of the biggest colonialist ball through the Conference of Berlin,
laquelle a accouché d'un triple génocide qui a frappé notre mère patrie Afrique et bouleversé notre destinée, qui pourtant semblait meilleure depuis la victoire éclatante de nos ancêtres sur les forces esclavagistes dans l'île d'Hispaniola, aujourd'hui République dominicaine et Haïti.
In this city, with the Berlin Conference that gave birth to a triple genocide that shook our destiny and hit our mother patrie of Africa in relation to the former Isla Hispaniola, that is now Haiti.
Le premier de ces triples génocides fut le génocide géopolitique qui a détruit tout l'héritage politique de nos aïeux et morcelé les grands empires et royaumes africains en des petits États berlinois, aliénant ainsi nos territoires aux royaumes esclavagistes et colonialistes européens.
The first of this triple genocide is the geopolitical genocide that has destroyed all our political heritage of our ancestor, put in pieces the big empires of the African realm in small Berliner state.
Le second de ces triples génocides est sans nul doute les génocides culturels monstrueux commis sur l'Afrique et son peuple.
The second of this triple genocide is without a doubt the cultural genocide, the monstrous cultural genocide perpetrated on Africa and its people.
lequel génocide a occasionné la destruction de nos identités, de nos sociétés, la disparition de nos traditions et us coutumes, le pillage de notre patrimoine culturel.
This genocide produced the destruction of our identity, of our societies, the disparition of our tradition and our customs, the looting of our cultural heritage.
Notre patrimoine culturel, l'ensemble de nos pièces et entités, compris par œuvres d'art, enfermées aujourd'hui dans la plupart des musées européens, dont le plus cruel et inhumain est celui de Berlin.
All our pieces and entities known as the art pieces are now closed today in most of your museum. One of them, the most cruel and inhuman one, is the one of Berlin.
À travers le projet Humboldt Forum, le gouvernement allemand a non seulement servi les nostalgiques de l'Empire, destructeurs de notre patrimoine culturel, mais aussi consacré la cruauté humaine.
Through the project Humboldt Forum, the German government not only served the nostalgic of the destructive empire of our cultural heritage, but also consecrated the human cruelty in exposing in this museum.
En exposant dans ces musées le reste calciné de villages et de ses habitants camerounais massacrés par les colonialistes allemands, avides des richesses culturelles, minières et économiques de l'Afrique.
In exposing in this museum the leftovers, the burned leftovers of our villages and the Cameroonian inhabitants massacred by the German colonialists in greed of cultural wealth, mineral wealth and economical wealth of Africa.
Ces génocides culturels a malheureusement entraîné l'extermination de nos frères et sœurs, en l'occurrence nos compatriotes Nana et Herero en Namibie.
This cultural genocide unfortunately produced the extermination of our brothers and sisters, in this case our compatriots Nana and Herero in Namibia.
Nos pères et mères au Congo, qui ont vu aussi leurs mains coupées pour l'appétit insatiable du roi des Belges, Léopold II.
Our father and mother in Congo, who also had their hands cut for the insatiable appetite of the Belgian king Leopold II.
L'extermination de beaucoup de nos compatriotes sud-africains et sud-africaines à qui l'on devait à tout prix ravir le plus estimé de notre patrimoine, à savoir notre terre.
The extermination of many of our compatriots from South Africa, to whom we owe the biggest price and the most estimated of our heritage, to be known as the earth.
Et le dernier de ces génocides, sans aucun doute, est le génocide cultuel, qui a consacré la suprématie de la culture et la civilisation européenne, renfermée dans sa religion, sur notre patrimoine culturel, notre spiritualité, ainsi que notre culture qualifiée à tort de sorcellerie et de sauvage.
The last of this genocide is without a doubt the cultural genocide that has consecrated the European supremacy of its culture and civilization, closeted in its religion, on our cultural heritage, our spirituality, and also our culture that has been qualified as witchcraft and savage.
Mesdames et messieurs, militantes et militants, combattantes et combattants, activistes et actrices culturelles, membres de la communauté humaine, le cas de l'Afrique est un cas douloureux parmi tant d'autres.
Mr. and Mrs. militants, fighters, activists, actors of the cultural actors, members of the human community, the case of Africa is one of the most dolorous one amongst others.
C'est pourquoi je joins ma voix au peuple Chicana et Chicanos, autochtones des Amériques qui réclament la restitution de ses terres et de son patrimoine culturel.
This is why I join my voices to the people, to the Aboriginal people, Chicanos and Chicanas from America, that claim the restitution of their land and of their cultural heritage.
Ceux du Mexique qui réclament aux côtés de tous les autres en Amérique du Sud et centrale la restitution de leur or pillé par les conquistadors.
The one of Mexico that claim with the other people of South America and Central America the restitution of their gold, looted by the conquistadors.
Ceux des Indes qui réclament à la couronne d'Angleterre la restitution de ses diamants.
The one of India that claimed to the British crown the restitution of their diamonds.
Et lui de la Tunisie qui réclame tout son patrimoine culturel et historique pillé à Carthage pour finir en Afrique.
And the one of Tunisia that claimed their cultural heritage and historical that's been looted to end up in Africa.
Si je suis encore ici devant vous, c'est parce que les statues, elles, ne parlent pas, ne voient pas, mais à ce que je sache, entendent.
If I'm here still in front of you, it's because the statues don't speak, they don't see, but they hear.
Jusqu'à présent, elles ignorent où elles sont, mais j'aimerais qu'elles entendent la voix. Oui, celle de la dignité, celle de la famille, et qu'elles sachent que nous ne les avons jamais abandonnées.
Until now, they ignore where they are, but I would like that they hear the voice, the one of dignity, the one of family, that they know that we didn't give them up.
J'élève ma voix aussi pour que les décideurs occidentaux et ceux du Vatican entendent la parole.
I hear my voice. I talk today also so that the decision maker of Occident and the one of Vatican hear my voice.
Car je suis la parole de l'humanité première, de l'humanité des origines, de l'humanité authentique, celle du respect des cultures et de la considération de l'identité de tout un chacun.
Because I am the voice of the first humanity, the humanity of the origins, the authentic humanity, the one of the cultural respect and the consideration of identity of the others.
Marcus Tullius Cicero dit Cicéron, l'un des plus grands d'entre les hommes du droit romain et européen, et plus grand d'entre vous, disait que les lois doivent être la matérialisation de ce qui est inscrit dans le cœur des citoyens et citoyennes.
Marcus Tullius Cicero, known as Cicero, one of the biggest men between the men of the Roman and European rights, one of the biggest between us, said that the law should not be the materialization of what is inscribed in the heart of the citizen and citizen.
Mais qu'avez-vous fait? Vous avez écrit le droit international et différentes conventions internationales, ainsi que les lois nationales relatives à la restitution et à la protection du patrimoine, sans vous soucier de ce qui est inscrit dans le cœur des Africains et des peuples déshérités.
But what did you do? You have written the international law and many international conventions, as well as national law relative to the restitution of the heritage, but you didn't take in consideration the heart of the African and the heart of the disherited people.
Alors écoutez-nous, dans nos cœurs d'Africains et d'Africaines est inscrit avant tout un désir profond de liberté, de dignité et d'unité.
So listen to us. In our African heart is inscribed before everything the deep desire of liberty, dignity and unity.
Dans nos cœurs d'Africains et d'Africaines est inscrit un désir de justice sur tous les crimes et génocides perpétrés contre nous.
In our African heart is inscribed the desire of justice for all the crimes and genocide perpetrated on us.
Dans nos cœurs d'Africains et d'Africaines est inscrit une volonté de rupture avec toute puissance colonialiste et esclavagiste.
In our African heart is inscribed a desire of rupture with every colonialist and esclavagist power.
Dans nos cœurs d'Africains et d'Africaines est inscrit notre aspiration de voir notre patrimoine culturel rentrer chez nous et sans condition aucune.
In our African heart is inscribed the desire to have our cultural heritage brought back to us in our home without any condition.
Dans nos cœurs d'Africains et d'Africaines est gravé notre souhait le plus ardent de la souveraineté et de l'indépendance culturelle, politique, économique, sécuritaire, financière et spirituelle.
In our African hearts, it's engraved our biggest wish, the one of sovereignty, of cultural, political, economical, security, economical and spiritual independence.
Inscrivez-le dans vos lois et dans vos textes du droit international.
Write it in your law and in your international law text.
Nous avons chargé Kimbangu. Vous l'avez emprisonné à perpétuité.
We have put in charge Kimbawu and you have detained him for perpetuity, forever.
Nous avons chargé Lumumba. Vous l'avez assassiné.
We have put in charge Lumumba and you have assassinated him.
Nous avons envoyé Thomas Sankara. Vous l'avez assassiné.
We have sent Thomas Sankara and you have assassinated him.
Kwame Nkrumah que nous avons investi, vous l'avez renversé.
Kwame Nkrumah, you have invested him.
Modibo Keïta renversé.
Mobito Keïta renversé.
Sylvanus Olympio assassiné.
Madibo Keïta pushed over. Silambu Olympio assassinated.
Malcolm X assassiné.
Malcolm X assassinated.
Et voici maintenant que la parole est venue. Oui, la parole de l'Afrique et de l'humanité authentique, réconciliée et apaisée. Écoutez-la.
Now has come the voice of Africa, of the humanity reconciliated and peaceful. Listen to it.
On ne demande pas l'autorisation à un voleur pour récupérer ce qu'il a volé. Unité, dignité, courage. Thank you so much.
We don't ask the authorization to a thief for recuperation of what he has stolen. Unity, dignity, courage.
Thank you very much, Mwazulu. Sarah, it's not so easy to to follow up, but I would still ask you to do your speech. Thank you.
Yes, what a speech, very hard to follow. After that, merci beaucoup pour ta présentation qu'on vraiment sent que ça vient du cœur de l'humanité même, je veux dire. But yeah, it's still law matters in this question of restitution, and so we have to dedicate a little bit of our times to these questions as well. Before I start with my presentation, which is not on this, yeah, so there it is. I just want to refer again to the idea of movement, and in that. I want to also thank Mboru, who's there, who's a very important partner in our restitution work. So, Shekamu Mboru from Berlin Postkolonial. And I also wanted to thank our team at ECCHR, because this work is obviously not, it's a movement work, it's a teamwork, and especially Judith Hackmark and Natalia Loyola Daikiki, who also work on those questions. So, but now you're stuck with me, and so I will talk a little bit about why restitution matters, and the right, whether there is a right to restitution, and how to maybe not to restitute if you want to restitute. So this is a little bit the overview. We'll see how far we get, and if we stop at one moment of the presentation, we can pick up some of the points later on in the discussion. So obviously, why restitution matters, and I think this issue came up obviously because international law and its colonial legacy is very much present and omnipresent in the conventions that apply to these questions of reparations and restitutions. So we have to decolonize the law first. So this is about, this is the part of the post-colonial, decolonial legal theory. So why restitution matters, second part. So we have to, because theory is theory and theory is important, but obviously we have to think about restitution as a praxis, as a critical praxis, and as a praxis of reparations. And we will see how difficult that is in the regime as international law is today, still today. So this is the part of a decolonial legal praxis. And then, this is a little bit the center of the whole presentation, why restitution and how to restitute. Is there a human right to reparations and restitution, obviously, because restitution is one form of reparations. And what are actually then the legal grounds and the respective challenges? So we will see whether, when we talk about the return of ancestral remains, there are some legal bases even in the German constitution that could serve to bring a claim, not only before court or whatever, but also before the institution, the collections that still hold those remains illegally. And then there is a second example of the return of artifacts. So is this a question of rights? And here now we get to the question of ownership, or is it a question of ownership? Or should we shift that approach from focusing on ownership to focusing on human rights and the human right to one's own cultural identity? And this, again, I think that could be opening up a little bit to the discussion and the exchange of ideas. Shouldn't we just go beyond the interstate and ownership paradigm altogether and shift more towards human and constitutional rights-based approach to restitution? So I think when you look at the international colonial legacy, I think we heard a lot by Mwazulu Diyabanza already on how international law is an instrument of hegemony, of colonial, post-coloniality still, and it's an instrument of oppression still of, and here we have these dichotomies of the safe claimed civilized, which obviously is the West, and then the so-called other. And the othering, obviously, is a very important process in order to establish one domination about the on the other. It's the uncivilized. So obviously, it's the sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty linked to the liberal nation state that is at the center of this and hegemonic approach to international law, and international law as a mode of legitimation for colonial domination and post-coloniality still going on. And obviously also saying that this law that we have is universal and neutral, which is far from, can't be further from the truth, actually, because obviously it's based in liberal understanding of positivist law, and obviously in complete rebuttal of other sort of legal cultures, or very important point, also other concepts of ownership. And that is also in the heart of who can claim to be a legal subject with rights and who is not, because only those who have a liberal idea about property are recognized legal systems under international law. So you see already how this is going. And then the center still and the periphery. So colonial repercussions, obviously we have that going on, and we will touch on that in the context of the restitution of ancestral, or the return of ancestral remains. Please excuse me if I sometimes use the term restitution, because that's the legal term. I know it could be offensive, but I'm talking about the law. The law is offensive, so why hide that point? And then I think we also touched on this a little bit as well, the epistemicide, what was said, le génocide culturel, the who is the knowledge, who decides what is, again, the civilized and the non-civilized. And then we still, because we're talking about human rights, we still need to think about whether still international law can have an emancipatory potential that we can use against itself, so to speak. So, and this is obviously nothing I came up. Those are the third world approaches to international law. Brave scholars, mostly from the global south, though sometimes transplant in northern universities. But I think there's a lot of going on there right now. They are also expanding their research to combining critical race theory and trial and capitalist Marxist theory. So I think there is a lot to unfold and to do with that, again, in terms of decolonial legal praxis. So human rights, yes, but obviously sometimes all of you have came across this, like, especially as a white Western-based NGO, like pretending we are the saviors of the world. Spivak just, branded it in a way like white men saving brown women from brown men. So this is something we need to keep in mind when we try to mobilize the emancipatory potential of human rights, especially when you talk about restitution as a redress for colonial injustices. So why restitution matters? The second part, here's the question of decolonial legal theory as a decolonial legal praxis So why reparation? Obviously reparations, and this term is sort of omnipresent in this whole debate. Colonial crimes are historical injustices. So if you talk about criminal law and the retroactivity, problem of retroactivity, or as we have it in international law, doctrine and theory, the principle of intertemporality, maybe you came across that, often prevents us from answering to those crimes, and they were crimes, with the expected tools of international criminal law. So then we have to think, what is colonial injustices are actually? Yes, they are crimes, but aren't they also ongoing present human rights violation and racial discrimination, even a human rights racism? This is why we need to turn to reparations, and then we have to think how they relate to restitution. And obviously, like everything, when we talk about the law, it comes with its own baggage, so to speak. So we have obviously often a very state-centered perspective that is very problematic if you think about individual claims, because normally, especially restitution, often are brought by governments. And often the human rights of those who are in search of their family members, they become negotiation leverage. We saw that in the genocide, like in the Namibia Joint Declaration, and I think I'm a little bit afraid that we could see it with the Tanzania-German negotiations. So yes, there are some movements, like obviously the international law is ever evolving. This is a little bit the basic principles. You don't there is a right to remedy, and it's a little bit state-centered, but at the same time there is a small shift towards a human rights approach to reparation and restitution as a form of reparation. And this is also a very central, I think, tool for decolonizing international law, the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. And this is clearly, it's a human rights declaration as customary international law. It is a legal source that grounds individual rights. So, and give me a hint if, in terms of time, Eva. But because I want to touch a little bit, so if I touch a little bit about these legal grounds and respective challenges, like 10 minutes, 5? Okay. Huh? Cool. So here we are getting started, because why are we thinking about, like, why do we need to think about restitution in terms of rights and not in terms of state responsibilities? Because they have an emancipatory potential, but this is, I think, the most central point. It's because if you talk about restitution, about especially ancestral remains, it gives us the opportunity to move beyond dehumanization, to say those are, and the objectification, especially of remains in the archives, because what we can claim or do, there are those people in the archives that hold against their will in these archives. They are people with their own constitutional rights. And so that is a very, very strong decolonial turn, because even in the beginnings of international law, in the modern international law, it was through these dynamics of difference that the colonized became objects of the colonizer. So they weren't, it was their land, terra nullius. They didn't have any rights. They were only objects of extraction, expansion, and exclusion. So with this shift, what we achieve is that they are legal subject with legal rights, and most importantly also with respective legal obligations by states to protect those rights, to not infringe on those rights, and to enforce those rights. It's not negotiable, so to speak. Here, and this is not, I'm talking to the already converted, the problem is here obviously that the current debates, especially in the mainstream media or mainstream discourses, frame reparations and restitution as a matter of interstate relations. We saw that with the Namibia-German agreement. They talk only about ethical duties to sort of redress or restore justice at their discretion. And again, the colonial legacy of international law, I already mentioned it, the principle of intertemporality. So if you look at the cultural heritage law, all of these conventions that might be helpful to address these problems of restitution of spiritual and artifacts, they are only from the 1970s, 50s, so forth, so long, much later than German colonialism took place. And so hence they do not apply, basically. And restitution is often framed around ownership and not individual rights. So return of ancestral remains. Here we can look, as I said, on the international law standards very briefly. This is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Obviously, then again, Western states would say this is only soft law, it's not binding, la la la. Again, a very, very repetitive line of argument and logic in order to shield their sovereignty from claims that could pierce through those veil of sovereignty. Because, and this is really a right to reparation and of human remains. So it's very clear cut. Again, I already mentioned that as an ongoing, because these people are still in the archive, you also could frame it as a racial discrimination and like an infringement or like a violation of the obligations under the Convention of the Elimination of All Racial Discrimination. You see, legal language is sort of what it is. But so that is interesting. This is something we are pursuing right now. Because there is a review process on Germany this year, so where we can submit some reports. And this is finally where we get to, yes, there could maybe be even like a German constitution, or a fundamental right to restitution. And again, These are like the same sort of concepts that come up. It's about human dignity. Restitution is about human dignity and the personal freedoms of those people. So saying they, because this is jurisprudence, there is a post-mortem human dignity, right to have your human dignity protected. And this belongs to everyone. It's not only for Germans, it's so for everyone. There's a right to rest in peace, derived from Article 1, and this is like the human dignity right to human dignity. And obviously then for the family, descendants, they also have their genuine rights, or they derive from the rights of the deceased, but right to bury and commemorate your deceased family members. I mean, it shouldn't be something surprising that there is such a right. And then obviously also to bury them, there's even an obligation to bury your family members. So why not for those in the archives? Racism could be one answer. Obviously, there's a lot of problems then with procedural law and evidentiary standards, just because there is no established precedent. Obviously, we also have problems with evidentiary, if you want to bring it before a court. Evidentiary standards in German procedural law are quite strict, which is good. I mean, basically it's good because it's a question of the rule of law. But because of the historicity of the wrongful acts and crimes, that could be difficult, and for factual reasons, these situations are messy and complex, which, by the way, they share with migration and conflict sort of litigation. So ownership, legal challenges to ownership claims. It could be that those objects are inalienable cultural objects, meaning that they couldn't have been the object of a contract anyway. You cannot buy those objects. And here I draw on the work of Evelyn Kampens, a very dear colleague of mine, and she's if you want to look up her writings on these matters, it's a very joy to read her work. So in German context, and I cannot unfortunately speak on the French context, but obviously you can, the question of acquisition under German law, is that possible? And unfortunately, yes, it could be possible, actually, to acquire, at least for the owner, for the object, you could acquire them. The problem, if there were contracts, and those, I know that from the Cameroonian context, there were contracts between collectors and, for instance, notables of the different communities. So the question is that contract valid or void? And then you couldn't, and there's this section in the German Civil Code saying, yes, the contract is not only void if it is against public policy, die guten Sitten. So what does that mean in the colonial context, and on which gute Sitten are we drawing? And here you can argue a lot that it is not because it's a transnational or transcultural sort of trade. It's not only the German gute Sitten that matters, but also those in place at the time in, for instance, Cameroon or Tanzania. There's obviously a consolation when we have looting, and this is then more clear-cut. So from that, if it's stolen, you can't acquire property. So this is, and obviously there's a lot of constellations where looting took place, so this is very, very easy. Wait. Obviously, there's a problem with statute of limitations. So in total, you could say, if, for instance, an object, an artifact, was the property of a fontem, like a notable of that respective community of the Mangi, then the museum, after buying it from the collector, is most probably able to acquire property under German law. And yes, German law is applicable, let's assume that for the moment. So that would be the moment where property is acquired, and it will be very difficult to challenge it. But, and here again comes in the idea of the res extra commercium, meaning inalienable cultural heritage, and the concepts of custodianships, then the person, even the fontem or mangi, has no authority to trade those objects. And then it only could be acquired, this means good faith acquisition from a person not entitled. But in these matters, and we did some historical research, most of those, at least for the Cameroonian context, they know about. They were very familiar with the cultures they were colonizing. So this is not an option. Hence, even if it is a contract, in that sense, it would not be possible for the museum to have property. And then there could be a claim to restitute. Same with the looting. Again, I said it's easier, so to speak. So we have at least one constellation where it will become very, very difficult to challenge the property claim of museums even. So there are a lot of other challenges, but what we say is, again, to shift the debate from ownership to human rights and constitutional rights approach, again, looking at international law, and then the UNDRIP, and then, again, because it's the strongest claim, because here we could go to a court to see whether, again, attaching to the Article 1 and 2 of human dignity and personal rights, in light of these articles, the right to cultural identity and also the customary international law of the UNDRIP. So finally, again, we have problems here. The main problem here would be probably having collective rights before German courts. That would be all, but then from a decolonial perspective, that would be really, really interesting in terms of challenging, again, Eurocentric conceptualization of human rights. So a lot to do. I want to close with that and leave it at that. You can just read it. You heard enough of my voice, and I'm looking very much forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to open directly to the public. I think you may have a lot of questions. Where is the microphone for the public, actually? Do we have one? Otherwise, I can already give you one.
Hi, my name is Sid, and I'm the son of colonizers, of Christian colonizers. I was raised in Africa and Guam. My mother was raised in Singapore. My grandma was born and raised in Tokyo, and my grandpa was raised in China. And I am here in Berlin because I am a third culture kid who has struggled with place. And I feel like I fit here because this place is full of misfits, and it's like the only place in the world where I fit. But that's not what I want to talk about right now. My grandmother went to Sarawak in Borneo when she was in her 20s or 30s, and she was gifted a human skull by a headhunter tribe in Sarawak, Borneo, which is in our family still. My uncle has the skull in his possession in storage, and I am here on a quest to find out how to return the skull and do it with what the process is. And when I saw this, I figured that I could find people who would assist with this process, and I would love to talk to you afterwards about if you have any information about Asia in particular, and the fact that it was a gift to my grandmother by the murderers. Like, how do we find the ancestors even, and go about this process of returning it to the rightful owners and honoring the memory of these people?
Mwazulu, tu aimerais répondre quelque chose?
je comprends la situation. C'est que nous, par exemple, dans le Front multiculturel anti-spoliation, nous avons lancé justement cette possibilité qu'il y ait de restitution. Du moment où il y a des gouvernements qui sont, je dirais, qui ne sont pas emballés dans l'idée de la restitution, mais aussi de recevoir tout ce qui a été pillé. Donc mais pour l'instant, je pense que c'est... Tu veux traduire?
I understand the situation. We, as the Multicultural Front against looting, have explored different possibilities of restitution, especially when governments are involved or not involved with their specific idea of restitution.
Parce qu'on a ciblé, en fait, si vous voulez, 3 institutions, je peux m'exprimer ainsi, qui doivent nous restituer tout ce qu'ils ont pris. Il y a des gouvernements, il y a des collectionneurs, des familles des collectionneurs, mais il y a aussi des hommes et des femmes, c'est-à-dire toute personne qui, comme dans votre cas, a justement ses patrimoines. Donc, en ce qui concerne la zone Afrique, nous avons commencé à récupérer et à faire en sorte, nous sommes en relation avec des communautés locales pour justement essayer, à chaque fois qu'on a de pièces, le rapatrier justement afin que s'il s'agit de ces cas-là, que les personnes soient dignement enterrées, ou s'il s'agit des œuvres d'art ou des pièces comme ça, qu'ils soient réintégrés notamment dans des communautés locales. Mais pour l'instant, c'est encore Afrique.
We target 3 institutions. We target the governments, we target the collectors, art collectors, and looting trips, as you said. And we target men and women like you who are in possession of objects and ancestral remains. And we have started to get these objects and ancestral remains back and to be in contact with the local communities to find out where the objects and artifacts have come from, and also what they are about, and if it's, for example, cultural artifacts or heritage, how can it be reintegrated into the community?
Sarah, would you like to add something or no?
So I mean, these sort of constellations are fortunately not those constellations where you need us as lawyers because you're already ready to restitute. I think this is just, it was Asia mostly, right? So maybe I know some, like a provenance researcher, she has a lot of, like she's also part of the Berlin Postcolonial Isabel Reimann, and she works on that, and at least, or she might have networks. So through those networks, Leipzig Postcolonial, you might be able to get those contacts again to the communities, and then it's up to the communities to decide. Yeah.
Are there some other questions? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Mo Loschelder. I'm from Berlin, and I'm just interested in colonization in general. I mean, I'm political and being. So, just some days ago, we were at Humboldt Forum, and passing by the African section, and also passing by the Cameroon Pearl Throne. And we just came across a guided tour in German, and the tour guide, he was explaining a little bit about the history of the throne, and he was saying like, yeah, there are some activists who want to return this item and others. So it was a bit disrespectful about the idea itself. And also, it was clear that he, it was for us hard to understand if he was talking for himself from a personal view, or if this was like he was not trained by the museum properly, but in a way it was like, well, it was given as a present, and so why to give it back? And this then made me think about how much do people, like, let's say normal people, understand about the whole thing? And then also, and this is my question to you, in terms of the people, like the people in charge, how much do they understand, like from their heart? Because I think this is a main problem. If somebody doesn't understand the idea, even if there's laws, you're hitting a wall. So my question is, how much are you hitting a wall by facing individuals? Do you understand what I mean?
Yes, maybe I can answer that a little bit, because the problem is it's not only about individuals, it's about a structural problem, and it's about the colonial context in general. So it's sometimes if this person says, okay, it was a present or so, it doesn't matter, because it was a violent context. The colonial contexts are violent contexts. So to for instance, again, going back to the law, that would be probably very hard to argue. But in terms of, law is just one language. I think this is something you need to push a little bit more. Yes, for that, at the end, it would be wonderful if they all would do that by their heart, but at the end, it's, I don't care, because you're infringing upon my rights. So stop it. And if you understand, well, super, but if not, and this is, again, why I think it's so important to understand restitution as part of reparations, because reparation is not about punishment, because that is also sometimes why people are sort of refusing to acknowledge what Germany as a colonial power, other colonial powers have done, but what they are still doing, because they don't want to face that they are part of the problem that is still continuing, perpetuating that violence by working in these institutions, by guarding these collections, by exhibiting them in certain ways that are unacceptable. So again, I think we are far away from the moment where we can convince them to feel something in their heart, because there are moments and instances where we, like institutions like the contact point for collections from colonial context, that is exactly there, that communities and individuals could go there and ask for instance, their ancestors, but also artifacts. At the moment when they started to offer a data bank, they uploaded like skulls, human skulls, together with animal skulls. So, we are so far away from touching their heart, we're not even touching their mind, So, and it's, again, I think more about the structure at the moment.
Tu voudrais répondre aussi quelque chose, Mwazulu?
Bon, je ne sais pas si j'ai vraiment saisi le fond de sa question, mais je voudrais dire dans cette approche-là que nous, quand nous abordons la question de la restitution, on dit souvent qu'il y a la réparation qui passe en premier. Quand on commence la restitution, le premier geste de la restitution, c'est la réparation. Et dans la réparation, la première de toutes les réparations, elle est d'abord morale. Donc je pense que c'est ce qu'elle disait. C'est une question d'éthique. Il faut d'abord accepter que l'on a commis un crime, que l'on possède quelque chose qui ne nous appartient pas. Même ça, là, déjà, ça nous suffit de reconnaître seulement. Parce que là, le problème, je pense, qui est soulevé, il y a des sourds institutionnels qui ne comprennent rien, qui ne veulent rien entendre, qui refusent catégoriquement. Déjà, la première démarche, elle est morale, elle est éthique.
Okay, traduction. I'm not sure if I have thoroughly understood this question, but I will try to answer anyway. When we approach the question of restitution, the first step is moral. It is an ethical question. We have to accept that we possess something that is not ours, and institutions categorically refuse to accept this.
Mais ce qui est bien, c'est que l'Allemagne, comme tous les autres pays de l'hémisphère occidental, ce sont des sociétés démocratiques. Et dans une démocratie, à ce que je sache, la volonté du peuple finit toujours par triompher, où les dirigeants vont finir à un moment de s'incliner devant la volonté du peuple. Raison pourquoi toute notre démarche consiste aussi à une construction de ce que nous appelons la conscience collective. Parce que si cette conscience-là émerge au niveau de populations ou de peuples justement de ces sociétés démocratiques, les voix vont se lever et les dirigeants finiront par s'incliner.
Ok, traduction. But the good thing is, or the good message, news, Germany, like other countries in the Western Hemisphere, is a democratic country. And as far as I know or understand, in democracies, the will of the people tends to find its way or to arise. And therefore, sooner or later, there will be intelligent people who will raise their voices and make themselves be heard.
Okay, thank you both for your talks. Also, relating a little bit to that also. So one of the things about restituting or returning both artifacts and, of course, remains is the massive research that has to go into each and every one of these objects to find out, to who exactly and in which way it should be restituted. Besides this little note that objects and artifacts tend to have, which says maybe a time and space and maybe the material it's made of, usually, like a wooden bracelet. And I know that there are some museums here in Germany, for instance, with third-party projects trying to look into these things, but it's of course a massive work, and right now there's so many communities all over the South that are mobilizing themselves to try to get these objects and artifacts and remains back. But it seems to me that massive work should be something which is a work done by the perpetrator and not a work which gets done by the victims. Is there, since we have a lawyer with us today, I was wondering, is there any legal framework to hold responsible the states, for instance? Because there's, beyond the state-to-state restitution of giving a state back, state of borders that were in the first place drawn by colonizers, it's about giving it back to specific communities. So do we have legal frameworks for that to hold states responsible for instance, putting also the resources behind tracking down the things and where they should be returned to and under what circumstances? And having those dialogues, which tend to be quite long?
That's exactly the tricky part in a way, and the argument that the provenance research is super expensive and time consuming it's true, and it's a stronger one. But yes, so there are different levels how to address them. To say, like, for instance, in terms of international law, you could say, yes, Germany, you have an obligation under the CERT to just start the research, to fund it. So that is something that we want to bring forward. The problem, again, with human rights on the international level, it's the enforceability. So, but hopefully there might be a momentum to bring that and to say, okay, you have to put your money where your mouth is. Then the other one, and this is what I was trying a little bit, like I was trying to do to show, is that doctrinally, if we want to address colonial injustices through positive laws, through the laws as we have it, you have to do, like, there's this massive effort of interpretation and argumentation how to push for those obligations. And so the thing is that in Germany you have the Information Freedom Act claim, but this is, you only get the information and then it circles back. We don't have the information because we didn't research it, so it's an impasse. So what probably would be, what needs to be done is to have a claim to push them for research, like a claim to research. And that could be one way, and this is very highly experimental. It could be saying, like, because there's a human rights and a constitutional right to restitution. In order to really enforce that, you have to do the research. So it's part of that claim. And it's, again, sometimes it's better to have an individual claim than an interstate obligations, because then again, like the states, for instance, Tanzania and Germany, they could negotiate about it. So they could say, okay, we take the dinosaur and some remains, and the rest we forget about it, as long as you put, and then they can prioritize. They can say, we put the money in this research and not in this one. And this becomes then completely random. Yeah, that's exactly why we're going down this road of individual claims. And this is exactly the colonial legal praxis, because you have to use those existing laws that normally are instruments of power to read them against themselves in a way that a judge still would follow your argumentation.
Are there other questions in the public? Maybe some comments. Patrick, Christian, maybe you already have some comments. Mboro.
If there aren't any questions, I add something to you.
You would like to add something?
Yeah, because again, going back to the idea of like how to get them to the point where the idea of restituting is coming from their heart. Reparations, again, is not something, it's a toolbox. You can use, like you can design so many ways how these people could engage and understand and learn and engage with the communities and so forth. And that could be, reparations also could be a way to move forward, so and to learn and to heal. And for that, I completely don't understand. I mean, I understand why the German government is so adamantly refusing to use the terms of reparation in any context of colonial crimes, be it the Namibian case, it's the strongest example, but in any other, because then it acknowledges that there is a legal responsibility. But I think there are various, much softer forms of reparations, and be creative and use that. And yeah, so I think that is, again, because it's not a punishment, and it's much more, and could be also a forum and to redress and to heal both sides.
Mboro, please.
Yep. So when we are talking about the restitution, we are talking about those cultural objects which you find that most of them were looted during the colonial time, and that is the truth behind it. And if they were not looted, they were stolen or taken by force. And always I hear gift, a present, like when we talk about Manduyenu from Cameroon, you find all this which they're trying to say they were presents. They were forced, our rulers, they were forced to give aid. Because just imagine a ruler, our chief, a traditional leader, he cannot give the crown as a present. Because if he gives the crown, then he is no longer our ruler. So you find they were forced But then you find always there are these arguments which they are trying to please themselves, which will not please us, because we know where they're right. And now, when I look right now, how the Germans, they are playing, now they've agreed to return some of the Nigerian bronzes. Although not all museums, some of them already. And now these bronzes were looted by British soldiers in Benin. It is not the German who looted it, the British. And this is what, and then they bought from the British, whereby they knew that they were looted, and it is not now their property, they have to give it back. Which now I do say, okay, thank you that they are giving it back. But I am asking you a question. Up to now, in all the museums, especially here in Berlin, in the Ethnological Museum, you find that there are thousands and thousands of objects which were looted in the colonies. Up to now, a German government hasn't given really objects which they looted back. Just only recently, there is the Ngonso in Cameroon where they did, after a long pressure, where they have agreed they are going to give it back. But you find, just ask, what do they want to show the world? Because I always, Germans are forward giving these objects back, but they haven't given any object which they looted. They haven't. Or even, they are not even prepared to give them back. And then when you come to the question of our ancestors' remains, this is not just only an object. It is something very, very different. It is our ancestors, whom you find generation after generations of those colonized. We are still waiting to have them back, to bury them according to our traditions. And yet, they haven't given them back. The communities have already been demanding. And now, for instance, the case of Tanzania. Now I hear everywhere Germans are prepared to give them back. And I've been asking myself, because I am working on it. I have been working on it for years and years, more than 30 years. And now I hear that they are prepared to give them back. But to whom? What they do tell me now, they wanted to have an official demand from the government of Tanzania. And when I talk to the Tanzanian government doesn't know even to whom should they give the demands, to the cultural minister, or to the chancellor, or to the president, or where are these human remains? They don't know. Anyway, I know some there and there, but they don't know where they are and how many of them. So you find all this what they are playing around, this kind, I don't even see as tricks. It is really, when we come to the human remains, it is not something to play around. It's not something to play around at all. At all. And then when you come to the objects, for instance, you can see how they do undermine us. For instance, the dinosauria. in the Natural Museum here in Berlin, which belongs to Tanzania. Even they put a kind of, not an argument, that they asked me, will you be prepared, or will you be pleased when we give a replica to you? A replica. The object belongs to me and not to you. And you are telling me that I should get a replica. Might be you ask the other way around. If I am prepared, that you get a replica of it. So you find all these levels, the way they are taking us, they are not really taking us equal with respect. Just imagine, recently, 20 objects which belongs to Namibia. So they were to go there in the National Museum so that the Namibians, they can have a chance to see them. And they wanted them to be there as a loan. How can you give me something to my museum which belongs to me, and we are saying it is a loan? So really, we have to work hard on it and see what is going on around. Thank you.
Thank you, Mbo. Mwazulu, tu voudrais bien répondre quelque chose?
J'entendais là l'intervention qui allait dans le sens de deux dernières questions qui ont été posées. Et je constate que cette question, la question de la restitution telle qu'elle est abordée en Occident, posera toujours un problème et posera toujours de confusion et des débats interminables.
I hear an intervention regarding the last two questions. I see that the restitution as approached in the Occident or in the Western Hemisphere will always cause confusion.
L'une des questions les plus essentielles pour clarifier tout ça, c'est qu'il faut qu'il y ait la réhabilitation de la vérité historique.
One essential question is the rehabilitation of the historical truth.
Ceux qui ont commis ces actes doivent vous restituer la vérité en faits et gestes.
Those who have committed these acts and these crimes, they have to restitute, first of all, the truth.
Ce qui s'est réellement passé. Parce que vous voyez, avec tout ça, il y a eu l'idéologie coloniale qui a commencé déjà par nier au peuple déshérité leur appartenance à l'humanité.
We have to restitute the real truth, because what is seen as the truth often is also colonial ideology that has started by making the dispossessed people believe that they do not form part of the human community.
Ce qui justifiait, en d'autres termes, ou moralisait tous les actes qu'ils ont commis après.
This ideology
ce qui moralisait et qui justifiait les actes qu'ils ont commis après.
This ideology justified and moralized all the terrible acts and crimes that they have committed.
Même la loi de façon générale, ou les lois d'ici, sont inefficaces.
Even the laws, the general law or also the laws from here, are not efficient.
Prenons l'exemple de ce qui s'est passé à Paris. Pour restituer au lieu de 28 d'ailleurs, mais le gouvernement français a restitué 26 au lieu de 28 œuvres pillées dans le palais royal d'Abomey.
For example, what happened now in Paris, the French government has restituted 26 instead of 28 of the treasures of Dahomey.
Alors les mots ont des sens. Dans cette question-là, les mots ont des sens. L'État français, à travers sa représentation nationale, a voté une loi, je cite, une loi d'exception.
The French state, through their international representation, has voted for an exceptional law.
Or, quand on parle d'exception, c'est qu'il y a la règle.
But the condition for exception is that there is a rule.
Donc l'État français a refusé catégoriquement de suivre la règle des choses. Nous avons volé, il faut restituer. Donc passe par sa représentation nationale pour faire voter une loi d'exception pour restituer et nous dire on ne fait que ça, mais pas d'autres. Donc d'autres doivent rester, d'autres pièces, j'allais dire.
The French government refuses to follow a rule. They refuse to say we have stolen, we have looted, and now we have to return. They prefer to go through a bypass, saying that it's one exception and we will do this once, but not in other cases.
Donc tout ce qui en sort après, ce sont justement ce que nous appelons des faux fuyants, des artifices qui leur permettent justement de gagner du temps.
Everything that follows up on this is a masquerade, is not real for us, it's just for them to win some time.
Parce qu'en évoquant ici la question de la demande officielle, parlons du gouvernement tanzanien, en République démocratique du Congo, en 1973, Mobutu, en tant que président de la République, a fait une demande officielle.
We were speaking here about the official demand of the Tanzanian government. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 1963, Mobutu did an official demand.
Les différents chefs des autorités qu'on appelle coutumières ont reformulé la demande pour appuyer aussi la demande de Mobutu.
And the different custom authorities, we call them, have also made official demands to support the official demand of Mobutu.
Mais en ce qui concerne, par exemple, la pièce Nekouko, une pièce qui se trouve à Tervuren en Belgique et qui circule dans tous les musées européens, ils ont dit niet, catégorique. Ils ont refusé.
But regarding, for example, the piece, please correct me, Nepokuin, that is a piece that is in the Museum of Tervuren in Belgium, the Royal Museum for Central Africa. They have categorically refused. They have said no.
Donc il y a une volonté d'éviter les conséquences qui en découlent, une volonté de continuer, parce que certains considèrent ça comme des butins de guerre, comme des trophées qu'ils ne doivent pas rendre.
Some might consider this the war trophies.
Et c'est pourquoi, pour en finir là, Martin Luther King disait que nous avons le devoir de désobéir face à une loi injuste.
So, sorry, some might consider these war trophies and therefore not see the necessity and not have the willingness to return. But I will cite Martin Luther King. We are obliged to disobey to a law that is unjust.
Donc ces lois-là sont injustes, c'est pourquoi nous avons développé la diplomatie active qui consiste justement à aller récupérer ce qui nous appartient sans demander l'autorisation et la permission aux voleurs, aux prévaricateurs et aux receleurs.
And these laws are unjust, so we have to disobey, and so we have developed what we call the active diplomacy, which consists in going into these museums and taking back what is ours without asking nor the thief nor the person that is collecting and storing or curating for a permission.
Thank you very much, Zulu, for these last words. We would make a short break now of 5 minutes, let's say, and then continue with the second session after the break. Thank you.
1, 2, 3, ja. Ja, hey, sa, sa. Ja, ja, hey. 1, 2, 3, ja. Ja, 1, ja. Ja, so, 1, 2, 3, ja. 1, 2, 3, ja, hey.
Thank you very much. So we'll start this second session of the Time for Denial is Over, the discursive program of the ghosts are returning during this CTM festival. And for this program, I'm really honored to have Lars-Christian Koch and Christian Nyampeta with us to present their work, but also to extend the conversation that started in the previous session with a particular focus on what we could call intangible. So we will have, during this session, a presentation by Lars-Christian Koch, and then we'll see the movie Sometimes It Was Beautiful by Christian Nyampeta, and then we'll convene for a conversation with all of us. Lars-Christian Koch is the director of the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Arts in Berlin. He's the director of the collection of the National Museum in Berlin at the Humboldt Forum. So he's professor of ethnomusicology at the University of Koch, honorary professor of ethnomusicology at University of Berlin, of the University of the Arts at Humboldt Forum. So he has done extensive projects about sounds, and his research has a special focus on instruments making, Buddhist music, popular music, urban culture, and historical sound recording. So we are very honored to have him. So we'll do a small presentation just to open the floor for the conversation that we'll have together here. And then we'll move from there. So Lars-Christian, please.
First, thanks for the introduction, Patrick. Very kind in this way, and I'm very happy to be here to have a conversation. And I'm here in my position as an ethnomusicologist, working in the field of immaterial culture. And in this case, it's important first to state what is intangible heritage. And if you take it in a broader sense, we definitely have everything like oral tradition, everything connected to language. We have all the performing arts like music, dance, and theater. We have all the areas of practices, of rituals, of festivals. We have all the knowledge and practice about the nature, about the universe, about the world as total. And we have the knowledge on crafts, the knowledge on how to make things. In some of these fields, I was working as a researcher, especially on the oral tradition of music, the music in itself. I think it's important for the discussion later on that I'm trained in Indian music, in a school of Indian music, and I'm also trained as an instrument maker in India, so that I had to have some connections to immaterial culture in itself. I had teachers who transmitted knowledge orally, and this has some impact on how to deal with this knowledge. I would just like to talk about UNESCO, and you have to realize that the awareness on something like intangible heritage is not as old as we consider it to be. UNESCO only 2003 just had this agreement, the Convention on Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage worldwide. And Germany only signed this 2013 as number 153 of the whole world list, for more than 2,000 states, so pretty late. In connection with this concept of intangible heritage is definitely the concept of authorship or copyright. First, we have, in the sense of authorship, a very subjective and absolute right on the safeguarding of knowledge of intangible heritage as such. It means music, films, pictures, and so on, and creativity. This is also a very important point. You should definitely consider creativity in this connection of copyright and the whole law system. And if you see Western, it means European history, then also this concept of safeguarding of intangible heritage is not as old as we think normally. Only in the Renaissance, the concept of an individual who is an author was gradually established. And if we just consider the case of music, everybody here knows the GEMA. This is an association of safeguarding of composers, of authors. The GEMA was just founded in 1933. But it's huge business. We should also be aware of that. The GEMA has something like 80,000 members worldwide. They're responsible for more than 2 million authors for the rights. The whole income they had to distribute is more than 1 billion euros a year. So it's a huge business if you are considering something like intangible heritage, in this case music. I will come to this point a little bit later. The case is that talking about intangible heritage has the system that an author is an individual who is owning his work. It means also his creativity, and he's being paid for that. Again, this is a very Western concept. If we are talking about societies outside this very close idea of identity of individuals, then we have the broader way of communities. And I already explained that I was just trained in a tradition of music where you had a repertoire in a family, in a school, and this was shared as a whole from the community. So you were never allowed to give it to anybody else. You were not allowed to play something from a different gharana, from a different school. So there was a kind of copyright system, but not concerned as an individual, but as a community. This is something we don't have in our law system. This makes it complicated in a few cases, because we can't talk in this case on a legal situation on ownership. What I mean is that seeing the collection we have from the late 19th, early 20th century on sound recordings, especially in the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art, namely the phonogram archive, we have early recordings, the so-called wax cylinder recordings. The earliest one is from 1894, and the whole collection is more than 16,000 recordings worldwide. These were all done in a time where copyright was not an issue. But you had a connection. In a lot of these cases, you had colonial backgrounds, colonial contexts. And they are of different states. You had context where business was involved. The very early recordings in India were made by record companies, in theaters, with musicians in the city like Kolkata. It was a huge market in Asia which was established. The first printing unit on records was just established in Kolkata itself. But you also had something like the prisoner of war camp recordings here in Germany during the First World War. The so-called Prussian Phonographic Commission was established. They did recordings in prisoner of war camps in Germany for more than 5 years. We're talking about 2,000 recordings from different languages. Language was a very important part, from different music, because we are talking about a world war. So you had recordings from Korean prisoners of war, from Georgian prisoners of war, from Armenian prisoners of war, and so on and so on. All these recordings are digitized. They are available for researchers. They're also available for the communities, and we had publications being done. This is what we do in the phonogram archive for the last 20 years. In cooperation, we publish these historical recordings to get it public. Just one example, it's a series of CDs like this one. These are the Armenian recordings from the prisoner of war camps. We've done this with one of our Armenian colleagues, and in this way we are connecting back to the communities. And then this repertoire is open with the understanding of the communities itself. I'm just mentioning this just for you to get an idea what kind of collections we are considering. And I just stay here for this period of colonialism. And considering the back cylinder recordings, we are talking, as I said, about 16,000 roughly. But later on it continued, recordings continued from the 50s on tapes and then on digital units. So we just count roughly something between 12 and 14,000 hours of sound recordings. And this is not the whole thing you find in Europe. It's much more. So there are much more so-called unique recordings worldwide, recorded in a time, in a period where we don't talk so much about colonial context, but I would just say it very open. We talk about a situation where the legal situation of these recordings were not safeguarded. That means even in our legal situation, if you have something from different cultures, it's so-called public domain because there's no author. And this is a critical situation if you're talking about something like restitution, like ownership, like restitution of contemporary material. And this is something, it's always kind of case-to-case basic. We have to discuss it. I will just give you one example on how we deal with it. I already showed you this one, and we have also recent recordings in the same setup, where we try at least to get closer to the authors and safeguard what they did, safeguard their creativity, and also pay them if this is negotiable. Who is owning the recordings? And I was just reading the introduction of today's, and there was this big question, how can all these recordings be just handed over again to artists, musicians, researchers, and local communities? For me, this direction is a little bit strange because we would start with the local communities first, because this is the material they are the owner of. I'll just give you one example. We have a huge collection of Navajo recordings. They are considered as sacred material from the community. We approached them discussing about something like, World Heritage documents and so on, and the community very bluntly said, it's not the world's property, it's our property. And we are deciding who is just able even to listen to it. So what we had to do, we had to invite somebody from the community, and Kina was here last year, a young ethnomusicologist from the Navajo Nation, and she was researching on these recordings and just making sure which is really sensitive, which is sacred, and which can be listened to. And now they are just discussing in the community how to deal with these recordings. I can just give a few more details on this specific case because it's really interesting how different the reactions in a community can also be. It's not always clear also on our partner's side what to do with it. Also about the prisoner of war camp recordings. It's very difficult sometimes to get a situation where it's very clear from the community this is okay to publish it, it's not okay, and so on. So I think this is something we should discuss later on. I would just give you a few more points on the ways of restitution. How can we restitute this kind of intangible heritage? I already mentioned the publication way. CDs, online it's possible in a digital format, but then again it's the question, how do you restrict it? The next thing are restudies. We have a huge collection from India from the 1930s, and we did extensive restudies in India with the different communities. So they listen again to the recordings, they make comments on and so on, and these things we also do publish in a different way then. The next point on restitution is first residencies. People come over, research it, and then decide what to do with the whole content. And we are just going to increase this. We started with a project this year with the so-called collaborative museum. We'll have a very strong part on residencies in our collection to work especially on this content. And we want to have the communities working straight away with the content. In some cases, we already know that this material might be that old that they don't know what it really is. We had this in a few cases, and it's pretty interesting how quickly languages change, how quickly the perception of music changes, and in this way also how they can just reattain the content for themselves. And then for discussion later on, I would also just bring one topic up. I think this is not so much discussed till now. Was there something like a colonial soundscape? This is something people don't discuss at the moment, because I really think that during the time of the colonial period, the soundscapes in different countries and different cities changed considerably, which is not documented. I know this from Calcutta, where I lived a long time, and I can easily make out how the sound of the city changed, must have changed during this time. I think this could also be for artists an interesting point to discuss. I stop here, and I hope we still have a fruitful and very intense discussion later on. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lars. I think we'll have a good conversation on this intangible, so music as an intangible form, and what are the modalities of such a restitution. I think it's really interesting to come back to that between the institutional approach to it and the community, artists, and other sensitive approach to the knowledge around those practices. So I will introduce you our second panelist, Christian Nyampeta. Christian is more than a friend, he's a brother. So as a writer, as filmmaker, as thinker, he has produced a lot of various, his practice is very hard to describe because it can be heavy research, such as his PhD, and it can be space to convene people, which looks like an installation, which looks like a playful ground or a movie such the one that we will see. And I think one thing that always touched me in what he does, and one of the things that the community around Waza in Lubumbashi are always very interested by Christian's practice, is how he always mixes a kind of conviviality to a very deep thought. And so it doesn't mean that thinking so I think one phrase that we used to in our family, another roadmap, is people who think together, dance together. And I think more of Christian practice is more that way, that the music, the feeling of the togetherness are embedded in the knowledge sharing and production, so it is very great from what Christian does. Thank you very much. May I ask to my fellow panelists to come back? Christian, merci beaucoup. Yes, it might take some time to come back, but I would like to ask Christian to give us a little bit of context, because there's always this momentum in museum to invite artists for residency, and also, and that comes with some expectations. There's this kind of healing expectations that an artist can help a museum to go to a healing process. Sometimes some artists are interested by going there. Sometimes they can go too far in that. But sometimes artists are interested by something completely different. And what kind of negotiation can take place in that moment? And how did you manage to come with this product that looks so much like you in an institutional negotiation that is not that easy as we can think?
Can you hear me? Yes. Thanks again for the question. And starting with giving a bit of context, first an internal context is that it's always very challenging for me to watch the film. I almost break down, which was also the conditions under which it was made, especially at the later part where the harding, it's really where, so it's not staged. This is the actual effect of being surrounded by what I call possessions, not so much cultural belongings or artifacts and so on. I think following the term of some First Nations in Canada, I refer to the term they use of these goods as possessions, in the terms that they are possessed and they have been possessed. So yeah, I speak from that sense of quite alerted emotional condition. So regarding the film, it didn't start as a film at all. I was invited very kindly by friends and colleagues in Stockholm to maybe think about a year-long residency that would be staged between, well, organized by Tensta Konsthall, which is a space for contemporary art, and more, located just about outside of, in Stockholm, on the suburbs, and in a place called Tensta, which has its own history. It would be a very long evening if I was to go into all of it. And then the collaboration was between Tensta, so it was a program that looked at, it was called Sites of the Future, which tried to look at the similarities and differences between countrysides and the city. And so it was about 4 other artists, maybe alongside myself, who each were put together with other institutions, and my choosing was between this Ethnographic Museum of Stockholm and a space called the cinema you saw, which was it's located about 2 hours from Stockholm, where they have it's a place called, oh yeah, so the collaboration included something called People's Houses and Parks, which is a legacy of social Sweden, if you like, where workers at the time needed spaces to organize, and there weren't any, so they started buying up land and built these community houses, some of which still exist, and I think it's organized nationally through these People's House and Parks. Interestingly, the People's and House and Parks that I worked with, located in Hallstavik, had this amazing cinema that was somewhat underused. Fine. And then another institution was also in Hallstavik. It was called the Heritage Association, which is a somewhat, I would say, situated on a different political spectrum, maybe opposite in the sense that, you know, Heritage Association tends to be rather conservative, as the may sounds. But I accepted the challenge, not without challenge, because I kept wondering, what on earth am I doing in Sweden? What do I have to look for here? Why not invite an artist who is located here, who can actually benefit from a working period of a whole year? It's going to be very hard to reach me. We're going to have to work across time zones. You know, questions that are not trivial. And And at the same time, I kept going back to why was I invited and trying to honor the people I work with and admire and respect, Maria Lind being one of them who had extended the invitation. So over the course of the months, it wasn't clear at all what I was going to do, except for the fact that I really, really wanted to study the musical instruments within the holdings and the collections of the ethnographic museum. So I was thinking about maybe making them, remaking them. I have some kind of practice around making musical instruments, among other things. And often I try to work with something called, again, this is a tangent. Anyway, maybe we may get back into it. And so over the time, each time I was in Stockholm, again, I felt this, I guess, difficulties of being there and trying to understand what exactly was meaningful for me to do while honoring my other life worlds, in which I partake. Rwanda being one of them, Congo, New York, the Netherlands, London, and so on. So I wanted to do something that would somewhat circulate without it being a documentation of that experience. And again, we're talking about really an experience between different institutions, some of them contradictory, all kinds of pressures, but also, forgiving and open in some other ways. So, and then I started thinking, like, who else has visited Stockholm like me? So in the collection of the Ethnographic Museum, I started seeing these figures, these people who've been there. That's how Yasser Arafat came into the picture. Wallace Soyinka and all these other figures who had passed through Sweden and perhaps had felt as I was feeling. So I started, in a way, assembling these figures, some of them ancestors, other controversials, and all kinds of figures that might have had similar experiences as mine, somewhat to draw from them, but also to find strength in them. And over the course, again, it dawned on me that one of the collections was called the Nyqvist collection. And so I looked at my host, I was like, is it Nyqvist, the Nyqvist? They were like, yes, it is the Nyqvist. Nyqvist being, of course, the renowned cinematographer who has worked in Hollywood, who is famous for having worked with Ingmar Bergman, especially through the treatment of the lighting. So he's known for setting up lighting phenomenally by, barely using artificial lightings, but and yet the scene looks quite singular, especially at the time. So I was somewhat shocked but also maybe not to discover that, or to realize rather, that there's a whole collection that had come from his parents who had been Swedish missionaries in Congo. And so I started learning that, in fact, Sweden had a whole mercenary army, which is why I have these collections of spares and whatnot that had ended up in different collections there in Sweden. So from that moment on, suddenly the project became a film. So I told everyone, like, we are going to make a film. It's going to premiere in that particular cinema, and all the institutions, we all agreed, like, okay, it makes sense. And so the place, Hallstavik, was built. It's an industrial city. It was only built because the paper mill that you see, or images of which you see, was established there because it's near by the water, so there's a port and so on. So they built a whole paper mill. So the thesis, I guess, with a paper mill with a paper is to say that, in a way, what these Swedish missionaries brought is paperwork. First being the Bible, being one of them, as this way, as introducing new taxonomies and new ways. So it's hard to imagine how such a project would have worked without paperwork. And so in order to produce, so there's something fascinating about this material that can, in order to make it, you need to transform a living entity, a tree, cut it down, transport it often over. So you need to build, you need so much resources in order to be able to flatten and decolor and then transform again. So there's something, to me, it exemplifies the beauty, the ingenuity of humanity, but also its madness. Yes, that's the paper side. So not so much in a nutshell, that's how the film came to be. Yeah, so it started as a musical project and then ended up being a film, but I think there's something retained in terms of, I guess, the musicality of it, but we can talk about it again without me hoarding the microphone. But I also wanted to say that in a way, I had to think of an interview. There's some kind of historical conversation between Edouard Monique and Léopold Sédar Senghor, where Edouard Monique says something like, it's always tricky and even contradictory to ask a poet to talk about their work. Poems should be self-sufficient, yet the first called to the witness stand is always the poet. So I'm always thinking, I'm simply wondering what it makes sense to say about a work that it is a work and, should exist on its own. But so I hope I do it justice by simply narrating a few things about it.
Thank you very much, Christian. I would also wanted to bring back some Senghor quote. Just to come back to this question of the intangible heritage and modalities of restitution. He was saying, putting the difference between the griot, the griot, and the ethnographer in the way they share what they have discovered, because they are doing very similar work of telling the story, transmitting the memory, the collective memory. And so he was saying that the griot has much more capacity to bring enthusiasm, to create a common sharing of their sensitivity, and therefore are better ethnographers than the scientists who came and kind of freeze the knowledge into writings. And then my question to Lars-Christian and yourself was to this, how do you position your practice between the griot and the ethnographer? How do you think that the knowledge you collect or you share, the sensitivity you share, is something that can stay alive and not be frozen in archive? How do you, because in this UNESCO way of safeguarding, the dynamic of transmission is like transmitting the same and not allowing the life of the practice, not allowing the practice to grow, because they want it not to die and then they freeze it. So how do you relate with those two questions, the question of the griot and the ethnographer, and the question of transmission with keeping the possibility to modify and to keep it alive?
I'll try and be very brief. I'll jump in here, and maybe what I would say is a bit philosophical, but I also think it's really a praxis in response to that question. I would say that in my understanding, any of the work that I'm engaged in is really an exercise in freedom. I think that's the ambition, and then I'm very much of conviction, again, and also praxis that my freedom is bound to yours. Otherwise, there's no freedom. So it means that in terms of making knowledge, it's indeed the exercise in making knowledge towards freedom in a manner that is indeed bound to your own freedom. And so I don't know if therefore what categories then start to emerge in terms of like a griot and an ethnographer, but I think therefore there's a necessity to engage and to share. But in fact, I had also a question around not exactly, well, I think it's somewhat related, and I'll then pass on the mic. It's also really thinking about, maybe extends your question and it will help me to answer it. It is thinking about, I guess, why is it necessary to call such a work like ethnomusicology or ethnographer? Like, at what point does music become ethnomusic? Like, why is it not just music? Like, could it just be music? Does it have to, like, at what point is a people ethnologized, essentially? So maybe Senghor can answer that, or maybe you can, or maybe you can.
Lars. You have to see first why these recordings were made. It was not the case that they wanted to collect music. These people who started to establish something like a phonogram archive had a certain question from their research. They wanted to find out, does human mankind listen in the same way? This is what they wanted to research. So they collected worldwide to prove that we all listen in the same way, that we perceive sound in the same way. They didn't realize that they were just collecting different repertoires, different memories. This was just the next step, when they realized what they were doing. In the prison of war camp recordings, it was very important for them to record as many languages as possible, to document the language. Again, it was a research unit first. And then the history of science started in the way that they tried to compare, and this was exactly why they started, compare the musics of the world. To see, are we different? Are we the same? And then they realized definitely the music is different, the perception is not. And then they tried to document the different repertoire, different music. Of course, it was a classification, Europe and outside Europe. This was something which happened in the same way of ethnography. This thing is not what's happening in the field of ethnomusicology, which is definitely a debatable and a strongly debated terminology at the moment, that we are talking about music, and music is, I just hesitate to say a little bit, is universal, but music is a part of culture, of all different cultures. Music is a part of memory, and memory is a part of music. So in this regard, what we have nowadays is surprising for a lot of our international partners. We have recordings, the content, people who recorded it didn't realize what it was. And now working with our international partners again on this repertoire, we just discover a lot of different structures of memories. We try to reestablish the whole situation, and we try to, and this is what our partners do, let's say in India where I was working, they're just writing a music history on these early recordings they have now. We must also say this kind of collection was not going on only in Western archives. I already mentioned about the situation in India, because it was a huge market on sound recordings. Already around 1910, they had a repertoire of more than 10,000 recordings of Asia. They produced it in Kolkata and distributed it in the whole Asian market. Different repertoires and different content. Again, it was a business. a very strictly and straight business, but also creating a repertoire and a memory, which created a lot of problems in the sense of the music community. I don't want to elaborate it too much, but I think this thing is that the repertoire, which is recorded, which is collected also in a commercial way, just opens up suddenly, so you can copy it. I think this is really important to mention. You record something which you can listen again and again, so you can also copy the whole thing. And even in my generation, some of my music friends said in some concerts, I'm only playing this piece when nobody is recording it, because it's family property, it's our Garana's property. I don't want to have it anywhere outside. This is what I mean about recording, copying, having the rights on the memory, and then also just the kind of re-establishing your memory out of this old intangible heritage. This is something we don't talk much about at the moment, and I think we should go much more into detail. And the next step, and then I will stop about explaining so much, this also reconnects to material culture. We're talking about early recorded instruments, and they are sometimes in the collection as well. So you can reconnect material culture, immaterial culture, and also the stories of oral literature. You're mentioning the griots. This is definitely the history, an orally transmitted history, which is recorded now. We have a lot of recordings of this thing, and this is again transmittable.
And thank you very much. And this is exactly what we try to see with this session, to also know that the object, the material culture, has something behind or something inside, as Christian always say, the interior of the history, and the interior of the object as well has this intangibility of rituals, music, dance, and knowledge practices that also needs to be taken care of in this whole process that we want to bring common knowledge of restitution. I will quickly open up. We have very small amount of time, so please be brief and say to whom you ask the question, so we can take more questions. Yes, there.
Thank you very much for the screening and for the important discussion. My first question or comment goes to Mr. Koch. In the reference to this archive and the research that Annette Hoffmann and Britta Lange did on it, notably in their way to refer to the phonogram and sound archive as human remains, precisely from the background that there was no consent on the recordings. And so that the reciprocity that you're referring to as a common ground, as something shared, precisely in this humanist approach that Christian Nyampeta's film also refers to, is not given. And so that there is a right beyond death, on dignity beyond death, that could be the grounding for the restitution of these recordings. So I wanted to hear you on this point, and maybe as a linkage precisely to the film and to the moment that actually resists the objectification that is part of the museum history, and that I have the impression the film is refusing to make as a move. Thank you.
You rightly mentioned about the recordings from Namibia, and Annette Hoffmann started very early to work with us, and she took the recordings over to get the knowledge about the content. And now we know much more about the recordings, about the content. I would not say the challenge for us is who we contact, who is able to realize what's recorded, who is the authority to work on these recordings. This is something we just struggled for a couple of years, and we had some really interesting and nice experiences, and some were just not happening. I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples. just restituted recordings to Tanzania, to the University of Dar es Salaam, and they couldn't make out what's on the recording because the Swahili language is pretty old, too old for them in some cases. So it's still there. We didn't publish. We have no clue what's on these recordings till now. Maybe it will change, but not yet. We had partnership with our colleagues from Palau, and first they were not interested in because it's an old recording, it sounds horrible, so we don't want to deal with it. And suddenly we just managed to get them over. We cleaned the recordings up, and they re-established the material, and we also published some newer materials in the sense of reinterpretation of the whole recordings. But in this case, we could go straight to the community. We knew who to approach. And it's getting more sensitive constantly. Who we talk to, who is able to say exactly, you can listen to this recording, this is the content, and we are working with you. And all of this is, you can follow what I mean. It's, in the case of the Navajo, for an example, we have two different groups in the community. The first group said it's illegal, you have to destroy everything. The second one says it's our repertoire, we don't have it anymore, so we have to get it back. The third one said the recording was not made during a ritual, so it's not sacred. So we can't decide. We are depending on the community, what's going back, what's coming back. And the connection to the collection in the museum itself, if we find objects which are straightly connected to the recordings, we are definitely documented, and this will be part of the restitution process. Again, who is the owner? I think this is still an open question. Who is the owner of this intangible heritage? In some cases, it was composed by supernatural beings. So, considering our law system, you can't deal with it. And this is something we have to discuss in a very open way. How do we deal with these kind of ownership? Again, something we just can only do with our partners from the communities and find out how we can manage it. In some cases, we have to restrict even the recordings that nobody else can listen to it. I think it's also a fair, respectable thing. And coming back to Namibia, to all these recordings, whenever you realize it's getting absolutely sensitive, there might be also a point that we just say, in accordance with our partners, nobody's allowed to listen to it again. It can happen, and we've done it.
Thank you very much. If there's a last question in the room, we don't have either someone who wants to ask a question. Yes, there's a hand over there. Thank you.
A question for Christian. Can you say 2 words about the music?
Thank you very much for the question. Christian?
Yes. So, yes, I would love to say a few things about the music. Thank you for the question. Maybe first, paraphrase it in relation to the intangible heritage. I think there's always something tangible about it. And maybe that's how the conversation should start, because nothing really exists in a vacuum. I think a direction towards considering musical recordings, hymns, songs, voices as human remains is actually a very interesting proposition, because the griot you spoke of earlier is a recording. It is that's both the camera and the cassette, if you like. And so any attempt and any culture that eradicates it is not simply destroying a human life, but is also all the material goods that go with it. The music come from particular material and instruments. That's what upsets us in the film, in the materials. There is sometimes the lack of that sound. And so in relation to the music itself, which saturates the film, if you like, it is an archive within our own hearts and minds. That's really how it starts. So here I am, a person who grew up in Rwanda, making a film about a film, or about films, filmed in Congo. So there's often a kind of, even within those who really strive for liberation, there's a trope in exemplifying Congo in many, many ways that I won't go into. So, for me, in order to work on this film, I really wanted to be as close as possible to my own heart, which is to say, to the recordings within my own heart, to the intangible heritages within my own heart. And musically speaking, well, Congo will be one of the primary orientations. So one of the main, I guess, the theme music, to use a parlance, departs from a popular song and then slows it down, elongates it, isolates elements of it, but within a take that my collaborator, who's also my brother, and I remember hearing this and what it made us feel at the time, not knowing what the song is about and so on. It's actually somewhat in parentheses, if you like. So it's both, say, a tribute, but also a re-recording of our own memories, which, of course, will not be ours alone. So it will be those of a generation that grew up alongside myself, and then the parents thereof, and it will be something that is shared across the border. So not just in Rwanda, but also, it would be something called, I think, a structure of feeling, if you like. So it's just, something that may connect us beyond words. I think they speak of this structure of feeling, in the sense that if you go to Guatemala, and you do a moonwalk, they'll say, that's Michael Jackson. If you do this, it will be Madonna. If you do that, it will be Tina Turner. So that song holds that power as well. So it's also like a generative image, an imaginary of a sociality that is imbued with a certain kind of a resistant heritage. And I call it resistant in the sense that the music often appears as a refusal, really, in the same that the dances do too. So, someone says something, often the Phoenix figure, and then the music blasts or the dances come in. So it's really a way of saying, no, I disagree, but without using the terms, the kind of the language, the intellectual kind of language that often the oppressor can win. So that's something about the music. I'm sure there's more.
There's definitely more. I will just ask Lars to his last comment, and then it's almost time to start our way to how Heinz for those who want. And I really suggest you do see the performance today. There's also the possibility to see it tomorrow evening. Lars?
Just a very, very brief and short comment. I really appreciate that the whole topic of intangible heritage is just getting into the focus now. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much. Christian, last comment?
Just also words of gratitude and appreciation for being here. And yeah, I also have many questions and I hope to submit them in some other forms.
Yes, it's always too short to have this kind of discussion. I'm sure they'll have more comments, but that's going to continue informally on our way to how Heinz, but also exchanging contact. And I think we are all quite open to continue the discussions via other mediums and at other moments. Thank you very much for attending this. The program will continue tomorrow for the time 49 is over, and I really appreciate we'll continue the conversation about music with some artists who's work with archives and so on. So please feel free to join and to spread the information. And so that's it for today. Thank you to Jan for the invitation and to Eva for organizing this amazing opportunity of gathering all of you. Thank you very much and see you at the performance and tomorrow.